Next up, we have an intellectually stimulating keynote by an eminent lawyer and politician, former Minister of Law and Justice, HRD, Science and Technology, a writer, a poet, and a passionate lyricist. Please put your hands together for Mr. Kapil Sibal. He will be deliberating on the topic of the rise of ethnic intolerance and its impact on the immigration policies globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just give me a minute. So I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon to talk about something that concerns us all. When we talk about ethnic violence, and we talk in that context of immigration policies, as far as ethnic violence is concerned, it's not something that has happened today. I think if you see the history of civilization, you would realize that ethnic violence has been part of that onward march of civilization. So it's not something that's happened today, and it's not something that will stop tomorrow. But the nature of ethnic violence seems to have changed. In fact, the nature of war seems to have changed. If you look at the numbers in the First World War, you realize that the number of civilians that were killed in the First World War was only 14%. The rest were soldiers. When it came to the Second World War, the number of civilians killed was 67%. That ended in 1945. Between 1945 and 1995, there is no war that has taken place, thankfully. But the wars that have taken place have been internal wars amongst ethnic communities. And in those wars, 90% victims have been civilians, as opposed to 67% in the Second World War. So with the decline of wars, you have the rise of ethnic fanaticism, ethnic cleansing, ethnic violence. And that's having an enormous effect on society. And if you look at the world today, you will find that there are 4, 5, 6 regions which are bedeviled with that problem. Syria, for example. As Syria accounts for 6 million internally displaced people. 6 million. And 5 million have left the country, fled from the country. And in the meantime, there have been about 300,000 deaths in Syria alone. Then you have Iraq, which has 3 million internally displaced persons. Then you have Myanmar and the Rohingya problem. 600,000 people have left Myanmar to go to neighboring countries. Then you have Sudan. 3.2 million people have been displaced in Sudan. In the figures, it may be much higher. We don't have exact figures on Sudan. Then you have the Congo, which is another 1.6 million people. If you total all that, it's about 14 million people, as I talk today, who are internally displaced. And they don't know what's going to happen to them tomorrow, because it's difficult to reach aid to them. And a lot of them are children and women who have really nowhere to look to. Many of them don't even have clothes. In some parts of the country, of the world, they don't even have clothes. They wait for somebody to donate clothes to them. They don't have food to eat. That's the plight of people around the world because of ethnic violence. Now, the question is, what triggers this ethnic violence? What triggers it? Mostly it's history. If you look at the history of the world and the movements of populations of the world, you realize that the genesis of all this is history. You saw it with the anti-Semite movement in Germany, and you're seeing it in Myanmar. The Rohingya problem is essentially a historical problem, because the Rohingyas really belong to Bangladesh. Because when the British were there, Burma was part of the empire. And people who speak Bengali settled in the Rakhine state. And there are lots of Muslims in other parts of Myanmar as well. But these particular Muslims were persecuted. They felt that they didn't belong to Myanmar in a sense. And they wanted some amount of autonomy, some amount of independence. They were given rights to vote at some point in time, but those were taken away. So this too is a historical problem. If you look at the Shia-Sunni conflict, which is again ethnic wars taking place, that's also a historical problem. If you look at the tribal conflicts in Africa, the genesis of that is all historical. So it's the movement of populations taking place throughout history, and the boundaries being demarcated as nation states, and communities not feeling comfortable with each other for reasons of history, they then become the genesis of the problem. And then, of course, with that comes the desire to seize power. When you have different communities in a particular country, and one community feels that, look, it's in a position to seize power, then the politicians in that country think it very profitable to divide the community on ethnic lines to seize power. And therefore, the political class also has an important role to play. And of course, then there are religious reasons. I mean, if you really look at Pakistan as it was at that point in time, remember, Pakistan consisted of East Pakistan and West Pakistan. East Pakistan was what? Historically, it was the division of Bengal into East Bengal and West Bengal. And East Bengal became East Pakistan. And the demographics, the cultural identity was all Bengali and Muslims. They had absolutely no affinity with the Punjabi Muslim who was dominating Punjab. And so there was no possibility of integration of these two areas, which were of course also separated geographically. So historically, this had to happen in a sense, because the Punjabi Muslim in West Pakistan was dominating, and a lot of the resources were not being invested in East Pakistan for the betterment of the Bengali community there. Even though they were all Muslims, but there were ethnic differences. So that resulted in ultimately the dismemberment of Pakistan and the breakaway. That too has historical genesis. You look at India and Pakistan, and you will find the same reason. When the partition took place, about 10 to 12 million people had to move across the borders. Personally, my own family was settled in Lahore at that point in time, and my father had to move and lost everything in the process. My maternal grandmother was killed in the process. Those are tragedies that happened. And the wounds of incidents like that take a long time to heal. And that then becomes the genesis of hatred. A lot of the Muslims who actually went to Pakistan were Punjabis who controlled the power structure in Pakistan even today. The Punjabi Muslim is in control of the military establishment, and he's also in control of politics. And the Punjabis in this side of the border are Hindus. So they belong to the Punjab, that's why they're called Punjabis. They speak the same language, but there is no possibility of a rapprochement between the two, partly because of politics, and partly because they are mujahids, they are converted, Punjabis who converted to Islam. That too, the genesis of all that is also found in history. We have a problem in Assam in our country. When Operation Searchlight took place, and that's the time when the dismemberment of Pakistan took place. And the date was, I think, March 25 to 1971. At that point in time, the Pakistani army went on a genocide spree. And so a lot of Bangladeshis moved into Assam. Now, Assam had its traditional population. And when you have these traditional populations, the moment the lakhs of Bangladeshis came into Islam, it changed the demographics of Assam. And the source of the conflict in Assam today is the influx of Bangladeshis because of the dismemberment of Pakistan, which too has a historic reason attached to it. And today the problem is not over. In fact, in 1985, at that point in time, Rajiv Gandhi and the student movement in Assam had an accord. In terms of that accord, we fixed March 26 or March 25, 1971 as the date on which all those who entered India, if they can prove that their ancestors were in Assam prior to March 25, 1971, they would be regarded as residents, the rest would be thrown out. They would be regarded as illegal. Because in the meantime, further influx has been taking place in Assam. So that's the genesis of the ethnic problem in Assam. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the genesis is all historical. And if it's historical, then the problem is that what do you do with it? You have to resolve the problem. And the only way to resolve the problem is to recognize that all of us have to ultimately live together. We cannot afford a situation where we live in continual strife. Unfortunately, the politics of it doesn't allow that to happen, because some parties in the political spectrum would like to cater to the Assamese and say, look, those people who came infiltrated into Assam are not genuine residents of Assam. And sort of that generates the kind of hatred that brings about violence. And that's really what is happening in many parts of the world. And in India today, there are very matters which are of great concern, because the political establishment, and I don't say directly, but many of them who support them are now adopting policies. For example, people, if they are found to eat beef, are caught and lynched. If a Muslim boy marries a Hindu girl, it's called love jihad, and there's an outcry, and they are attacked, and then of course many of those who are converted, they want to come back to the Hindu religion. So this is called ghar wapsi. So these are the kind of things that are now occupying the agenda of the country. And I think the Prime Minister himself has spoken against this. But at the ground level, nothing seems to be changing. And this is of course worrisome. And of course, the reason for all this is that your own inadequacies, you want to sort of foist on somebody else. If you're not able to get something done, you always blame it on your neighbor. And this is really the source of the problem, that we sort of build walls within our minds. You may have a wall between Mexico and the United States of America, but it's not going to help the problem. It's the wall in the mind that creates the problem. And we need to deal with those issues. Now, the other source of conflict, and I think that's even more interesting, and it perhaps applies to the United States of America in particular. The other source of conflict is the impact of globalization on economies. If you remember at Marrakesh and when the WTO was set up, the raison d'etre for the WTO was that, look, global trade will benefit the whole world if barriers are broken down and trade barriers are reduced. And the movement from WTO to the reduction of trade barriers did, of course, increase global trade. But people did not realize the impact of global trade on communities. And after, say, about 20, 30 years, we now realize that the rich have become richer and the poor have become poorer. That's true of the United States of America. That's true of India. In India, way back, about 43% of the wealth was held by 1% of the population. Today, that's increased to over 50%. The gap between the rich and the poor in the United States has also increased exponentially. And the result of it, the reason for this is that global trade enhances opportunities for the rich. It doesn't enhance opportunities for the middle class and those at the bottom of the pyramid. And we've seen that happen across economies, because global trade, of course, is great for the West because they are the ones who sell goods and services, and we are the ones who buy goods and services. So our trade deficit increases over time. If our trade deficit increases over time, we don't have the capacity to invest. If we don't have the capacity to invest, we don't have the capacity to create jobs. And investment takes place at the top end of the pyramid, in the defense sector, in the highly technical sector nowadays, in robotics, in artificial intelligence. The robotics and artificial intelligence doesn't do anything for the common man, because the common man needs a job. And robotics and artificial intelligence destroys jobs. And this is a big conundrum that the global economy is facing, because the West has to take care of being competitive in the global market. And therefore, the West do not have hands to do jobs. So they are moving towards a highly technical and technology-oriented economic system. And in our part of the world, you have 1.3 billion people who don't have the wherewithal and who are not associated with any of the developments that are taking place in this part of the world, and who need jobs. And if we want to compete with the rest of the world, we need to adopt technology. And if we adopt technology and reduce jobs, then our people are left unemployed. And this creates enormous tensions within society. And this tension ultimately results in violence, because ultimately those who lose the jobs first blame somebody else as the reason for losing the job. And this is exactly what happened in your campaign in the United States. The whole basis of the campaign was that we want jobs to come back to Americans. And these immigrants are actually making you lose your jobs. But if you look at the United States of America, the immigrants have actually, in the 2015, contributed $2 trillion to the economy. That's the reality of the United States of America. Indians are 6% in Silicon Valley, but 15% of all startups in Silicon Valley are on account of Indians there. But of course, the nature of immigration of communities in the United States is somewhat different from the nature of immigration in India, because in other parts of the world there is the push factor. That is, populations are pushed. Why does anybody leave a country? Because they feel uncomfortable, they may be persecuted, there may be ethnic violence, they are forced to leave. Nobody wants to leave his home or her home. When the home becomes the mouth of a shark, then you leave the home. And so that's what I call the push factor. Populations are pushed out of nations and other nations have to absorb them. This has happened in Syria. That's why, whether it's Turkey or it's Germany or other European nations, they're all absorbing populations of the push factor. And when 1947 took place in India, it was the push factor. People were pushed out of those nations. But as far as the US is concerned, it's the pull factor. It's not the push factor. Because here, after 1945, prior to 1945, you have the Immigration Act of 1924, where only the Western powers from the Western world people emigrated to the United States. This was the pull factor, not the push factor. After 1945, those who emigrated to the United States came from East European countries. And then, of course, after the Cold War was over, then people from Southeast Asia and other parts of the world also came to the United States. But these were pull factors, not push factors. And of course, US is very, very lucky in that it is situated across the Atlantic, so even Michael Phelps can't swim across the Atlantic and come to the United States of America. So in fact, you can control your immigration. So immigration is really not a problem, except for, Mexico and perhaps Canada. And the greatest Canadians have contributed enormously to the economy of the United States. Albert Einstein, the greatest physicist in the world, came because of Nazi push factor. And he had to come here. Meryl Streep, so many of your Hollywood actresses and actors are from other parts of the world and contributed enormously. America has been enriched by immigration. And for any president to talk about, setting things right and setting people back is counterproductive, because you cannot possibly. America is a nation of immigrants. But the point is, if the political rhetoric is that white Americans are losing jobs because Hispanics are coming in and doing the jobs, the result is you create a sense of discomfort in society. And within 10 days of President Trump coming to power, there were 900 incidents of violence that took place, of harassment, of people being beaten up and stuff like that. And once the word comes from the highest political executive in the country, then at the ground level, there is to American universities, whether it's Yale or Harvard or any of these universities. And if you really look at the faculty, a lot of them are people from outside of America. They have origins from other parts of the world. And if you look at the Nobel Prizes that are being granted, most of them are from American university or people of other origins. So I think that as far as the US is concerned, it is greatly benefiting. It's people in our part of the world with a 1.3 billion population that we, because of the push factor, have to deal with immigration. And we don't have the wherewithal to deal with our own people. So the stress on our economy is much greater, because you have the capacity to absorb. With being a 16-18 trillion dollar economy, you have the capacity to absorb. We don't have the capacity to absorb. But yet, I think that because in a sense, all of us are immigrants, one way or the other. And it's the real indigenous population that was discriminated against, whether it's the Red Indians or the Aborigines in Australia. We don't call them the Americans or the real Australians. But they are the ones who are really discriminated against. There is no such thing as indigenous population. I mean, human history and civilization has shown that all of us, our ancestors, one way or the other, belong somewhere else. If you look at India itself, I mean, you look at India, any race in the world is present in India. Every religion is reflected in the population in India. All the languages of the world perhaps are spoken in India. So we are in a sense a cauldron of diversity. And India too cannot afford a majoritarian culture. India too cannot afford ethnic targeting. That would destroy the very essence of what the Indian Republic is and what it's all about. So I think multifarious reasons have led to all this. And the world is moving towards right-wing majoritarianism as I see it. You see a 31-year-old elected in Austria. And you see a movement to the right even in Germany, in the recent election that has taken place. In India too, we have the right-wing party which is governing the country. And in every election, it's the right-wing rhetoric that appeals to people, because people love to hate. That's unfortunately human nature. You love to hate and you think that God is on your side. That's even worse, because you may want to hate, but if you think God is on your side while you're hating people, that's really dangerous. And people invoke, at least in many parts of the world, think that God is on their side, and that's why in the name of Allah you can do anything, or in the name of Ram you can do anything, or in the name of Christ you can do anything. And that's what's happened. So let's now talk about what America stands for. And it's something very interesting that I was reading the other day, and I'd like to share it with you. The founding fathers of the United States of America, and this is not something that has happened with President Trump. John Adams said, "Why should we take the bread out of the mouth of our own children and give it to strangers?" That's what John Adams said. And this is in a letter to the Secretary of State on August 14, 1800. Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton, both founders, were against immigrants. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt said, and I quote, "There is no room in this country for hyphenated Americanism." George Washington said, "Except for mechanics and some particular description of men or professionals, there is no need for encouragement." So you realize that Trump is not alone in this. There are many leaders who fear that immigrants will destroy jobs, will destroy the culture of the United States, will not be American. But Emma Lazarus on the Statue of Liberty writes this, and I'll quote. She says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lap beside the golden door." So there are two narratives around the world. One narrative deals with not being open in your mind and your heart, and the other to embrace humanity. I think we as a nation, we as a people, we as part of civilization have to decide for ourselves which narrative you want to embrace. And I think that the time has come for the world to realize that the only narrative that can give peace and tranquility and allow for economic progress and social upliftment is to embrace each other, no matter who we are, what religion, what race. It really doesn't matter. Thank you.
That was just such an awesome talk. I feel like it was History 101 for the world, not just India. It covered all the points, and having lived in this country for so many years, you actually brought out some things which I may have misunderstood or not understood, and I feel like I have that understanding now. So thank you so much for that. It was also intellectually very stimulating. as you can tell, I have many questions, but I'm going to restrict it to one because I'm sure there are a lot of people. So the Industrial Revolution, when it happened, it obviously displaced a lot of jobs because of automation. But then somehow we recovered from it. Like you made goods through automation, which then needed to be carried, and then the railroad was created, it created jobs, etc. So historically, whenever something happened like that, which displaced jobs, there was another sector that created them, and we could continue even with the rising population throughout the world. But somehow this whole robotics idea doesn't seem to hold that for me. Like, I'm not able to fathom where those new jobs will come from when you're going to displace so many jobs, and everyone's about scalability and automation, which is going to make the hungry hungrier. So what do you see as a natural phenomenon, or something needs to happen to create that new kind of jobs that we are not imagining about?
Well, I'll answer it in two ways.
Okay.
Let's deal with the latter part of the question. What do you think is going to happen? I think the world will evolve in a radically different way. I think we need to change the manner in which we educate our young. I think that you live in a world where you have a very active role to play. It's like walking to work, and then having a car to go to work. The car is an adage which allows you to go to work much quicker, but you still go to work. So I think that what's going to happen is, in years to come, the nature of education is going to change, and the nature of jobs is also going to change. But that I don't see happening, for the reason that a large part of the world, 6.2 billion people, out of that 5 odd billion people, or more than 5 billion people, are not going to have to wherewithal to change the nature of education. Right? So it's going to create problems. But then, the steam engine and railroad created a lot of problems that you don't think about, but you think of what happened to India when the railroad was created. What happened when the textile industrial revolution took place. All the work in India, we were exploited, and we were thriving at that point in time. It's the industrial revolution that changed the dynamics of British domination in India, because they would get the raw cotton and export the textiles and sell it. So they had it both ways. Had the Industrial Revolution not taken place, it wouldn't have happened that way. So you think that Industrial Revolution was a great stride forward, but think of that person in India who used to take cotton and used to make a living, now was exploited and he had nowhere to go, which is why we were steeped in poverty for hundreds of years. So I think that will continue. There are the haves in the world and there are the have-nots in the world. And the haves always have it and the have-nots never have it. That's the sad part. That's my answer.
So this is a question for Mr. Sibal, the intellectual, and Mr. Sibal, the politician. We talk a lot about India's leadership economically, India's global leadership economically. What do you think are some of the steps that India needs to take to demonstrate its leadership in ethnic tolerance across the world?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer in these times, because I think that this is not part of the agenda of India at all, about ethnic tolerance. I mean, the Rohingyas coming into India has resulted in a directive of the government of India, which I have with me. I didn't want to actually read it. Since you asked the question, I'll read it. Oh, maybe I don't have it. Maybe I've left it. Yeah, I've left it. Directive says that anybody, any that there is a potential of terrorism. The moment the Rohingyas came in, there is a potential of terrorism, and they may be terrorists. Most of them are children and women. And therefore, they must be deported as quickly as possible. I am, in fact, part of the litigation in the Supreme Court of India, and I'm arguing that the Rohingyas should be dealt with in accordance with international law. But the state's position is very clear, and that they all have to be deported because there is the possibility of terrorism. Now, I don't think that in that kind of scenario we can actually send a message to the rest of the world that we'll set an example as to how to deal with ethnic populations like that. And considering what has been happening since 2014, and the policies of the Indian state and the leadership in government towards ethnic populations in India, I'm afraid that we are not the right nation to set an example. That, of course, doesn't mean that all is not well, but there are matters of great concern.
Sir, ethnic violence, financial violence, political violence, I'm just trying to do some transitions here and taking an opportunity since you are here. Demonetization made a big impact last year on India as a country. Many of the people who understood the financial economics immediately criticized the way it was happening. 1 year down the line, and again, I go back to your own statement last year when you were fighting for that BIL versus Attorney General making a statement saying that 4 to 5 lakh crore rupees should be back. And now today, that whole of the population is witnessing 99% of the money being back. I mean, how would this be seen more from the emotional violence or the political violence if we try to fit the phrases, but at the end of the day, it's a common man who is trying to go through all this cruel emotional turbulence where some dreams were shown 1 year back and today the reality is really different. And if I may extend the same question, extending it over to the GST kind of an approaches where it started somewhere else, people started talking about 18% lock on that or the cap on that, and it happens again. And Mr. Chidambaram says, thank you, Gujarat. So on this perspective, I understand your talk today is really different compared to that, but I just could not hold my question.
To answer any question, not an issue.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so let's first understand what this demonetization did. I think that you got to understand this in the context of some facts. 86% of our economy was cash economy, consisting of 500 rupee notes and 1,000 rupee notes. Of the 1.3 billion people in our country, about 800 to 850 or even 900 million people earn less than 10,000 rupees a month. Consider that. Keep that in mind. So if I'm a family and earns less than 10,000 rupees a month, and I'm told on the eve of November 8, 2016, that my cash with me is not legal tender, you can imagine the impact of that on 800 million people. Okay? Now, 10,000 rupees in my house is legal tender. It's not illegal tender because it's cash. And that's the income, and it's less than, I don't even have to pay tax on it because the total number of people who paid tax at that time was 3.21 crores as opposed to 130 crores population. That's the number of people who pay tax in India. 3.21 crores at the time of demonetization. So I don't pay tax, my money is legal tender, and you declared it illegal. The result is, what does the man do? If he has got a father, a mother, a child in hospital, he can't give money to the doctor. Many people died. I can't buy food because the vendor will not accept the money because it's not legal tender. People actually, live on a day-to-day basis. Millions of people live on a day-to-day basis in our country. So, I think it was a surgical strike without thinking of the consequences of the poor in India. But because the media is in the control of the government, because of the fact that the media is controlled by industrial houses, and because industry survives on government patronage, no newspaper, no, especially the electronic media, was willing to see the reality. But the reality ultimately had to be shown, was shown by the declining GDP numbers. From 7.5%, the GDP came down to 5.7%. So this was an act of political violence, I agree with you. It was also an act of economic violence. It was a disruptive act, disruptive in every sense of the word, and destabilized India. But even today, the digital world calls it a great master move, because they were to benefit. The MasterCard, the digital transactions, the banking transactions, the transactions with your credit cards, they are very happy, because they take a percentage out of every transaction that is done. So for them it was a great bonanza. So you will still see people saying this is a great thing that happened, because India is moving from a cash economy to a formal economy. But what's the formal economy for a person who earns 10,000 rupees a month? So I agree with you. And then added to that was the GST. And we kept on saying, and I made a speech in Parliament, that you cannot have a GST with 6 separate rates. And with the highest at 28%. And then several sectors of the economy were outside the GST. The petroleum sector was outside the GST. Liquor is outside the GST. And states were imposing local taxes despite the GST. And today, of course, the day before yesterday, the finance minister now has reduced the rate on 270 items, which are, the rate was 28% to about 70 items, 240 or 70 items today. So all this we've been saying all along, and we've been proved to be right, but it is completely destroyed the job worker, the small sectors, the Varanasi, trade in Varanasi, in Agra, in Meerut, in Ludhiana, in Tirupur, in Surat. All of them were destroyed. 10 lakh people came on the street in Surat, and the television channels did not even show it. I do a press conference in the AICC, and the television channels don't show it. They just don't show it. That's the state of affairs.
So what do you feel about universal basic income? Do you think that will help rural India in any way?
We see, again, societies that cannot be transformed by, knee-jerk policies like this. You give money to a family, the male will go to a liquor shop and buy liquor. That's what he'll do. If you give him grain, at least he can't buy liquor with it. So you've got to understand the way society functions in India before you take up, theories like this basic income and it's not going to work. Your emphasis should be on education and health, and those are the two sectors that the government is not dealing with at all. They are saffronizing education, and they are paying no attention to healthcare. If you've got the largest number of children in the world who are underdeveloped, and see what happened in Gorakhpur, the way children died in Gorakhpur because of lack of oxygen. So I think that all societies evolve, and evolution needs a long-term perspective as to how that evolution is to take place without disruption. If you disrupt societies by knee-jerk reactions, you will bring chaos to the system, and it's not going to work.
spoke a lot about immigration in your talk. I wanted to know if, do you think that there's an underlying difference between the current immigration environment between the US, Mexico and India, Myanmar?
I don't think there's a comparison between the two. Because Myanmar is a push of migrants who don't want to go anywhere but have been pushed out, persecuted. I don't think that's the situation as far as, there's no persecution here. You see, in the why do people move out? People move out for several reasons. One, the push factor, persecution. Two, economic opportunities. Three, wars. Right? Now, people come to the United States. Why do people want to go to Germany? Why do people want to go to England? Why do people want to come to the United States? For better economic prospects. Right? That's why Mexicans come here, for better economic prospects. And if you look at immigrants in the United States, less than 1% out of every 5 immigrants is poor, and they contribute enormously. The rate of poverty amongst Americans is 14.5%. Amongst immigrants is 17%. There's very little difference. Right? So everybody has a job, everybody is educated. The real problem with America is the school system, if you ask me. If you go to Harlem and you have a kid in school there, he's not going to get a good education because the quality of the school depends on the neighborhood in which you live. And the more prosperous the neighborhood, the better the quality of education. The less prosperous the neighborhood, the poorer the quality of education. So you'll never match up. A black child will never be able to match up with a white child because he lives in those conditions. Right? But you can't compare this to India and Myanmar.
Hi sir, just wanted to continue on what you were talking about, the push and the pull factor. You said how America was the pull factor, and because of economic opportunities, students like us who travel from India to study here in the hope that they'll receive a job. In the current situation with President implementing such strict restrictions on immigration, do you feel like the situation is reversed where the US has become a push factor because of its no opportunities?
There's no question of US becoming a push factor because you're not going to send people out anywhere. Right? You may not bring more people in, but they can never be a push factor in the United States. But even this year, you've got 725,000 people who immigrated to the United States. So despite President Trump, 725,000 people have been given visas to come here, to immigrate. So I don't think anything is going to happen. I tell you why. Because politics doesn't control economics. Right? If you don't have the right kind of person for a job in the United States, somebody will come and take it. Right? And unless you educate middle America, educate people to be able to take up those jobs, merely by saying that jobs are being lost because of people who are immigrating is no good unless you prepare your people for those jobs. Right? That's the real question. And if we don't solve that, people are going to come anyway.
So, do you think all the brilliant Indians who came and settled here and were beneficial for the economy of US, if they would have not come all the way and just been at their home country and tried to develop their own home country, would that have helped in any way?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think so. For the simple reason that, remember, when you say want to do biomedical research or bioengineering or, something on robotics and some artificial intelligence, you don't have the wherewithal in India to be able to do that. Why do people come here? Because the higher education is much better. You've got much better labs, much better researchers, much better mentors. People who will guide you in legislation. That's, you make Nobel Prize winners through research. You don't have those facilities in India. So people come here. If they want to come here, they won't be able to do the things that they did here. So it would be, in fact, we're very happy that Indians are here and doing the work that they're doing. One, it's great for the United States. Two, that in a sense, in some ways or the other, we also benefit. Because people get inspired. And a lot of our people now are doing a lot of good research in India also. So there are collaborations that are taking place with the university system, even otherwise. But I don't think that it would have been better for India if they had not come. I mean, I think that gone are the days when we should think in those terms as a nation.
We have time for one last question.
Sir, I agree with you that it's restricted to think of national boundaries as the new reality, and kind of going off of that question that you cannot restrict immigration in that sense. But at the same time, isn't it a little unfortunate that even after so many years post-independence, when there was so much investment in education and technology, we have not been able to create opportunities and the infrastructure that's needed to do higher education better, or to do scientific research which can be cutting edge and at par with the global world?
You're talking about India, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, now, but the question is very, very thoughtful. But you look at it from our standpoint. We have 1.3 billion people, and we have what? Our economy is 2 point odd trillion economy, right? When I set up the Right to Education Act, I didn't have enough resources, even for that. So the nature of resources are limited, and the requirements of society of 1.3 billion people, you can't really understand, because if you put Europe and America together, it doesn't reach that figure. He's talking about Europe and America together and more, and then to give basic education to everybody, and we still don't have basic education till class 12. No right to education. Still, university education is very difficult to get. And our resources are limited. So we have to thank Great Britain and the Western world for having exploited us for so many years and leaving us in a state of penury. And you ask the question, why can't we do it? Why there's more money on research? We must have money to have money on research.
But isn't that also not taking ownership of how political leadership may have failed in all people?
What do you talk about political leadership? Do you know what the rate of literacy in 1947 was? 14%. 14% of India was educated in 1947. And today that figure is 72%, 74%. So what leadership, what ownership are you talking about? With that kind of no industry, zero industry in India, right?
But does that mean that we'll never come away from it?
No, but it takes years. I mean,
population's not
50 years is too short a time for a nation to be a global power. Right? We have global ambitions. We're not a global power yet. We can be, but it's going to take some time. And remember, you must become a politician to realize the problems of politics. Because it's easy to question as to why the political leadership has not been able to do this. Every policy that I was in telecom, as the Minister for Telecom, Minister for Education, Minister for Science, Minister for Law, every policy that I put on the table was opposed. Because there is no one policy, one size fits all. If I talk of education, I can't have one parameter for Jammu and Kashmir and the same parameter for the Northeast. I can't have one parameter for Bihar and the same parameter for Maharashtra. Because the nature of society, because we are such a diverse nation, is entirely different. What is required in Himachal is not true of Madhya Pradesh. So you cannot have a policy which is one size fits all. And if you do any tinkering with it, they say you're favoring this state or not this state, and there's a political agitation on your hands. Politics is not about running the government from the top. Politics is about the population's understanding that we too have to make sacrifices to run the government. And it's a two-way street. And it's difficult to run such a big nation and say that that the politicians are to blame for not taking the right decisions. Yes, politicians are to blame, and they must take the blame. But it's a difficult terrain to deal with.
I agree with that.